At 3:27 and 18 seconds, the E-2D Hawkeye, orbiting 92 nautical miles south of USS Abraham Lincoln, pushed a flash update into the strike group's combat network, and every display in Combat Information Center shifted at once. At 3:27 and 23 seconds, USS Sterrett's SPY-1DV radar classified 34 inbound contacts on bearing 041 at ranges between 119 and 133 nautical miles, while the carrier's defensive picture collapsed into engagement. Logic: 21 of the tracks were one-way attack drones, 7 were sea-skimming cruise missiles, 6 looked like cheap decoys, and that was the first clue. Trump's deadline to Iran was 4 hours and 11 minutes away, and the strike group had only 6 minutes and 54 seconds before the first tracks entered the outer missile envelope. At 3:27 and 39 seconds, the room believed it was seeing a hard but conventional raid aimed at Abraham Lincoln's starboard quarter. At 3:27 and 44 seconds, Lieutenant Commander Nora Hale, the strike group's passive sensor and electronic warfare analyst, realized the visible attack was only the outer layer. The first problem was visible. The second problem was the one that mattered. What the system believed was happening was not what was actually happening. To understand what is happening, you need to understand why a carrier strike group can be hurt without the carrier ever being hit. The carrier is the symbol, the target everyone expects, and the ship every radar operator is trained to protect first. But the strike group's real vulnerability in the final hours before a deadline is not always the hull that launches aircraft. It is the chain that keeps those aircraft in the air, the radar architecture that holds the group together, and the one support ship everyone assumes can survive because it is not the center of the picture. 19 nautical miles behind Abraham Lincoln, outside the room's emotional focus, USNS Guadalupe was carrying 176,000 barrels of JP-5 precision ordnance pallets, and the margin the carrier needed to launch repeated sorties after the deadline expired. If Guadalupe burned, Lincoln would still float, Lincoln would still transmit, Lincoln would still look operational, but its air wing would begin shrinking by the hour, and the deadline would become a bluff. Iran did not design the weapon to defeat the defense. Iran designed it to make the defense irrelevant. The real danger was somewhere else. 12 days earlier, Hale had filed a technical warning after reviewing 23 drone approach profiles, 8 electronic burst captures, and 1 pattern recovered from commercial traffic moving east of the strait. Her note was brief, specific, and easy to ignore because it attacked a comfortable assumption. She argued that if Iran chose to strike a U.S. carrier group before the political deadline, it would not try to sink the carrier with a heroic first blow. It would build a layered attack that forced Aegis to fight the obvious raid, while a second wave targeted the ship that carried fuel, the destroyer that carried the clearest radar picture, or the quiet link between them. She wrote that the successful attack would not look like a breakthrough. It would look like a defended carrier in a suddenly useless formation. Her assessment was circulated, discussed in a planning review, then filed under contingency analysis. Hale kept the problem alive anyway. She built a manual table of track loss behavior below 40 feet. She studied how long clutter rejection could hide low returns when operators were already watching a larger threat fan. She marked one sentence on the front of her notebook: if the carrier looks safe too early, look for the ship behind it. At 3:27 and 52 seconds, Sterrett launched 2 SM-2 interceptors at the leading cruise missile pair. At 3:27 and 57 seconds, USS O'Kane assigned 4 more interceptors to the remaining 5 missiles. At 3:28 and 03 seconds, an EA-18G Growler, already airborne west of the formation, redirected, jamming toward the upper drone block at 9,000 feet. The doctrine response was correct. That was the danger. At 3:28 and 11 seconds, the first SM-2 detonated at 44 nautical miles. At 3:28 and 16 seconds, 1 cruise missile vanished from the display. At 3:28 and 24 seconds, a second broke apart. At 3:28 and 31 seconds, the 6 decoy tracks widened, brightened, and began transmitting on overlapping frequencies strong enough to dirty the passive picture across two destroyers. They were not trying to survive. They were trying to own the room. Hale was not watching the center of gravity. She was watching the edges. At 3:28 and 39 seconds, she requested raw passive playback from the last 28 seconds. At 3:28 and 44 seconds, she found 4 burst emissions, shorter than 1 second each, all from slightly different azimuths, all ending inside the clutter corridor behind Guadalupe's projected wake. That made no sense if the carrier was the target. It made sense if the raid in front was opening a lane behind it. To understand why the defense is failing, you need to understand the difference between a defended ship and a defended operation. A carrier can survive a near miss, a drone scare, or a broken engagement line and still keep sailing. An operation cannot survive if the radar ship is blinded, while the fuel ship behind the carrier is forced into evasive movement and replenishment delay. The visible attack was not the whole attack. It was a sorting mechanism. It sorted radar attention forward, forced missile inventory expenditure high, and created the one condition Hale had warned about: a defended carrier, an exposed support ship, and operators convinced the attack was already understood. At 3:28 and 53 seconds, Hale asked for Guadalupe's exact offset. The answer came back in 4 seconds. 19.2 nautical miles astern, relative bearing 187. At 3:29 and 01 seconds, she asked Surface Search to rerun all dropped returns inside that corridor. 3 low-signature contacts reappeared at 13.6 nautical miles, speed 29 knots. Initially classified as civilian clutter because they had matched commercial profiles earlier in the watch. 29 knots was wrong. It was transit speed for explosive unmanned surface craft waiting for terminal queuing. The first problem was visible. The second problem was the one that mattered. At 3:29 and 09 seconds, another cruise missile disappeared under the sea return filter and then reappeared 8.7 nautical miles out, flying at 16 feet and no longer aimed at Abraham Lincoln's center line. It was offset. Hale checked the track prediction once, then again. The missile was driving toward Guadalupe's previous position, not the carrier's current one. That meant the missile had been handed targeting before descending below the clean radar picture. It also meant the low-signature surface contacts were not independent threats. They were the final part of the same kill chain. At 3:29 and 18 seconds, Hale told the tactical action officer, "They are not trying to hit Lincoln. They are trying to stop Lincoln from flying after sunrise." That changed the room. At 3:29 and 24 seconds, Hale requested 3 things at once: an immediate 2.1-degree starboard course shift for Guadalupe, a Nulka decoy launch from the rear escort, and a low search pass from the nearest MH-60R Seahawk. The request sounded disruptive because doctrine says you do not throw the logistics ship off its predictable line in the middle of an incoming missile raid unless you are sure. Hale was not sure about the exact shape of the attack. She was sure about the logic behind it. Iran did not need the carrier to burn. Iran needed the strike group to lose continuity. At 3:29 and 34 seconds, Guadalupe began the turn. At 3:29 and 39 seconds, the rear escort launched the first Nulka. At 3:29 and 45 seconds, the MH-60R from HSM 49 dropped low and accelerated aft along the wake corridor. At 3:29 and 49 seconds, the surviving offset cruise missile entered the rear destroyer's inner layer. An ESSM was fired at 3:29 and 52 seconds. It missed by less than 7 feet and failed to fuse. At 3:29 and 56 seconds, Phalanx CIWS opened for 2.4 seconds and cut the missile apart at 1,300 yards. The warhead fell short. The visible part of the second layer had been stopped. The hidden part was still coming. At 3:30 and 03 seconds, the Seahawk crew called first infrared contact on 2 surface craft. At 3:30 and 09 seconds, they found the third. At 3:30 and 13 seconds, they found something CIC had not seen at all. a low drone flying less than 60 feet above the water, 5.4 nautical miles from Guadalupe, using the surface craft as terminal relays and staying inside the worst part of the clutter line. The visible attack had pulled the strike group's eyes high. The real attack had stayed low. Hale's warning from 12 days earlier had been exact. At 3:30 and 20 seconds, the three surface craft accelerated from 29 to 46 knots. At 3:30 and 26 seconds, the low drone climbed to 71 feet, long enough to reacquire Guadalupe after the Oilers' turn, then dropped again. The room now understood the shape of the attack, but understanding and stopping are not the same thing. Guadalupe had 58 seconds before the low drone crossed its last safe geometry and the lead surface craft reached the Oilers' new wake line. At 3:30 and 31 seconds, the Seahawk asked for weapons release. Approval came 3 seconds later. At 3:30 and 37 seconds, the first AGM-114 Hellfire left the rail and hit the lead surface craft at 3:30 and 45 seconds, one gone. At 3:30 and 48 seconds, the second Hellfire destroyed the center craft. The third one kept coming because it was not the most important weapon in the lane. The low drone was. What the system believed was happening was not what was actually happening. The boats were the pressure mechanism. The drone was the precision mechanism. At 3:30 and 56 seconds, Hale called for a 7-second emission cut on Sterrett's forward sector and a 13% power increase on the aft escort surface search set. She was not trying to hide the formation. She was trying to move its electronic center of mass. If the drone was using passive terminal logic, it would drift toward the brighter false geometry long enough to expose itself. That was the one variable Iran had not fully controlled. At 3:31 and 03 seconds, the cut began. At 3:31 and 06 seconds, the low drone shifted left by 5 degrees, then 9. At 3:31 and 09 seconds, it climbed from 43 feet to 88 to reacquire the altered signal picture. At 3:31 and 10 seconds, the Seahawks crew had a clean line and opened with door gun fire, not to kill it, but to force it higher. At 3:31 and 12 seconds, the drone climbed to 126 feet. At 3:31 and 13 seconds, the aft escort's phalanx found it. At 3:31 and 14 seconds, the gun fired. At 3:31 and 16 seconds, the drone came apart 1,100 yards wide of Guadalupe's shifted course line. The third surface craft lost its update, veered toward the Nulka decoy, and detonated at 3:31 and 24 seconds against empty water. The second problem was solved. The visible attack was still collapsing in front of the formation, but now it was only cleanup. At 3:31 and 31 seconds, O'Kane killed 2 more upper band drones with SM-2S. At 3:31 and 42 seconds, Growler jamming broke link coherence across the remaining decoys. At 3:31 and 57 seconds, the E-2D reported no surviving cruise missiles and no coherent drone tracks inside 12 nautical miles. At 3:32 and 14 seconds, CIC declared the raid broken, but the attack had not failed because the U.S. Navy had fired more missiles than Iran had sent drones. It had failed because one officer had understood what the visible raid was designed to make everyone miss. Iran had built a layered strike for the final hours before Trump's deadline. The drones and cruise missiles in front were meant to force the strike group into a clean, satisfying defense of the carrier. The real objective was to blind the radar ship, shift Guadalupe into panic movement, and cut the air wing's fuel and ordnance continuity before the political clock ran out. At 3:49 and 22 seconds, Abraham Lincoln resumed unrestricted launch operations. The ship never stopped flying, Guadalupe never took a hit, Sterrett's radar never went dark. 46 minutes later, 2 F-A-18E Super Hornets and 1 F-A-18F launched with targeting data built from Hale's passive reconstruction, the Seahawks infrared capture, and the burst transmission pattern she had flagged before the attack ever began. At 4:27 and 51 seconds, follow-on strikes destroyed 3 coastal relay vehicles, 2 mobile cruise missile launchers, 1 control van, and the disguised trawler that had pushed the terminal queues into the clutter corridor. Iran's plan was not to sink Abraham Lincoln before Trump's deadline. It was to leave the carrier intact and the strike group useless. It failed because the system struggled, but the person watching the system did not. The ship survived. The logistics line survived. The formation held. And the one variable Iran did not calculate was the quiet officer who had already been thinking about the wrong ship before the first track ever appeared.